the Reconnecting Asia Project, which is one of the co-hosts or co-sponsors of this event. Delighted to have you with us, delighted to have our online audience as well. We always have a good following online. Welcome to you as well. In case you are in the wrong place, this is we're going to be rolling out a report of a task force on global infrastructure that we've been running for the last 6 or 7 months under the leadership of Charlene, Barshefsky, and Steve Hadley, and I'll introduce them in a minute. But I wanted to first get the administrative things out of the way. First of all, please, as usual, turn off your phones if you could. And then if there's any kind of emergency, basically follow me. We can go that way if it's appropriate, or down back through here. There's an emergency exit down to the alley behind, and the rally point is National Geographic, a block down here. Before briefly summarizing the report, I want to thank the sponsors of this project, Bechtel Group, IBM, and the Inter-American Development Bank, who very generously contributed to make this project possible. And so thank all of them. Thanks also to all the task force members and advisors and others who provided valuable insight into the project. Their names and affiliations are listed at the beginning of the full report, which you don't have in front of you, but it's online. I happen to have one of the few copies here. But there's an online version of this, and the full names and affiliations of the task force members and advisors is in here. You can find that. Let me emphasize that all the task force members participated in their individual capacities, not on behalf of the institutions with which they're affiliated, and they didn't necessarily agree with everything that was written in here, findings or recommendations, but there was broadly a consensus, I think, of the group about what we found and what we recommended. So CSIS has been following the global infrastructure build-out for several years now, including China's Belt and Road and other competing visions associated with this build-out. In the Reconnecting Asia project, led by my colleague John Hillman, also, by the way, the drafter of today's report. He's a great writer, and it's a good read. We're tracking over 14,000 projects on our interactive map and database at reconnectingasia.csis.org, which is advertised up there. So please go to the website and you'll see that the featured story right now is this event and this report. Our colleagues in the Project on Prosperity and Development have also done extensive work on quality infrastructure, on mobilizing private finance for infrastructure, and as you'll hear from my colleague Dan Rundy in a moment, also in helping stand up the new U.S. Development Finance Corporation, which is an important new tool that the U.S. government has to compete in this area. So now more than ever, infrastructure is a strategic issue, both because of pressing global needs. One estimate has it that the world's going to need about 90 trillion, that's 90 trillion with a T, dollars worth of infrastructure by 2040. Even if that's off by orders of magnitudes, we're talking about large amounts of money that are needed to build infrastructure. And there are competing visions for how to fill and meet those needs, with China's Belt and Road Initiative being the most prominent and ambitious strategic initiative so far. In fact, later this week, there's going to be a second Belt and Road Forum in Beijing that Xi Jinping is hosting with some 40 world leaders, not including senior American officials. Given the potentially transformative impact these changes in the world's connectivity could have for fundamental U.S. interests, CSIS launched the Global Infrastructure Task Force in October 2018 to help forge a bipartisan public-private consensus on a strategy for U.S. success in today's infrastructure build-out. Co-chaired by former USTR Charlene Barshefsky and former National Security Advisor Steve Hadley, the task force was made up of a diverse set of experts with extensive experience in government, academia, multilateral institutions, and the private sector. Under Charlene's and Steve's leadership, the task force started by identifying U.S. interests at stake, commercial, economic, and strategic. Next, we took a hard look at U.S. strengths and limitations in this infrastructure story. Obviously, given fiscal and political realities, we recognize the United States is not going to compete with China in terms of public financing for infrastructure. We're not going to spend $1 trillion. Actually, China might not spend $1 trillion, but that's their stated floor for Belt and Road spending. But what the U.S. does have is innovative companies that offer great products and services, and they follow the rule of law. We have deep pools of private capital, including large pension and insurance assets to support infrastructure investment. And we bring capacity and technology and other things to this story. And these are things that are highly valued in the developing countries that need infrastructure. So we actually have a real opportunity here to compete, we think. But as you know, if you got here by metro or through potholes, infrastructure is a challenging business, even in advanced countries. It's very difficult. It takes time. It always runs over cost. And there's a lot of risk associated with it. And so there's an important role for public policy in helping to mitigate some of those risks and to support private activity in this important business. What we need is a strategy for the United States, and to that end, the task force articulated a three-part framework, which in the summary of our report, this brief four-page document that you do have, you can see, we articulated a three-part framework for setting U.S. priorities. First, identify projects and geographies that are vital to U.S. economic and security interests, including especially digital and energy infrastructure, two key sectors for the U.S. and two areas of comparative advantage for the United States. Second, deploy and incentivize U.S. public and private sector resources in those key infrastructure types and geographic areas in close coordination with U.S. partners and allies, and that point is particularly important. We can't do this alone. Finally, monitor and encourage the build-out of infrastructure that poses no risk to U.S. economic or security interests. And, you know, a lot of the activity that's going to happen out there is, even if the U.S. is not directly involved, is going to help support providing public goods, and we should be supportive of that. Along with this framework, the task force put forward 7 policy recommendations, which you can find summarized in the inner fold of this briefing. At Charlene and Steve's urging, these ideas are, we think, bold and innovative, and they include specific implementation steps that you can find in the full report. And we intend to continue, we were just talking in the green room about ways to follow up and ensure that some of these recommendations at least get in front of policymakers in Congress and in the administration to try to get these things implemented. We hope you'll go to the URL listed and download the full report. It's only 35 pages, and as I say, very well written, so it's an easy read. We're looking forward to having a discussion about it today on the stage and then with you. And so with that, I'd like to invite my colleague Dan Rundy up to the stage with our panelists to moderate a discussion about the report and its findings and related issues. Charlene and Steve, if you could join us up here, and Peter Raymond who's a real expert in global infrastructure projects, and you'll see that in a second. Delighted to have all of them here. So with that, I will stand down, and I think
Well, great. Thanks, Matt. Thank you. I want to congratulate John Hillman on helping draft this report. It's really a great job, and I want to thank Macy McAlpin and Chris Metzger, who did a lot of work on this. But I'm really grateful to the two co-chairs, Charlene and Steve, for doing this, and I'm also very grateful, and we're really grateful to Peter Raymond. But my opening question to all of you is, you all have got a lot of other asks of your time. Why did you decide to agree to give so much of your time? You gave a lot, all three of you gave a lot of your time and advice to us to help make this happen. So why did you all agree to do this? Charlene, can I start with you?
There's a fool born every minute, right?
There's a fool born every minute. Exactly.
This project, to me, was really very important for two different sets of reasons. One is that the U.S. has long been a leader in development assistance globally. It's a tiny portion of the federal budget, about 1.2%, which is nothing. But it's close to $50 billion a year, and we've been pretty steady on that. And that provides important benefits to the United States in terms of making friends, preserving friendships, seeing growth in countries, raising living standards around the world, and so on, which is good for stability, obviously, but also ultimately good for the creation of markets for what we want to sell and what we would hope we would want to buy. The second reason, though, that I was drawn to this project is that the framework the United States has always had as a leader in this area, right, from the Marshall Plan to the Bretton Woods institutions to recent announcements on the Indo-Pacific and the Build Act and so on. The world's need for infrastructure is an order of magnitude beyond anything the world has ever seen. So that in the next 15 years, as much infrastructure will be built as currently exists in the world. This is very hard to get your head around. And the implications of this, I think, are fivefold, right? I think there's sort of 5 general observations I would make, and then I'll stop. I think the first is just the sheer need and the magnitude. Developing Asia alone, the estimate is $21 billion over the next 10 years. I mean, these numbers are astronomical.
Trillion.
Trillion with a T. Second is the Belt and Road Initiative. And this initiative is grand strategy for sure. And it's designed really to support China's global centrality, ultimately, certainly over the Eurasian landmass, and I think beyond. And this poses some central questions, I think, for the United States. Infrastructure meshes this massive global need with China's strategic ambitions. What is the U.S. response? We think it's critical that the U.S. have a response. Third is that the global infrastructure build-out, especially when you consider the technology build-out on 5G and so on, will change linkages between countries, create new links, maybe pull apart old links. And that has economic implications for the U.S. and strategic implications. Fourth, this build-out will happen, whether the U.S. participates or not. And it's critical, we believe, for the U.S. to participate in a sort of strategic and focused way. So for reasons, as Matt said in his opening, of economics, security, and the full range of assets that the United States needs to preserve and enhance, this project, I think, helps put down on paper what the group felt were the most important aspects that government ought to consider. And we put forward some recommendations we would hope the government would take into account.
Now, Charlene, can I also add that I think that you and Steve like working with each other and get along. I think that also was a selling point as well. That helped.
Ah, shucks. Yeah.
That's true. Good. So, Peter, can you tell me why did you agree to do this? And remind folks. So, I think most folks here will know who Charlene and Steve are from their past government lives. And Charlene was the former U.S. Trade Representative in another life, and Steve Hadley was the National Security Advisor in another life. They both have been active in the private sector for many years since. But Peter, you were at PricewaterhouseCoopers for many years, and you were really involved in infrastructure work in your professional life at PricewaterhouseCoopers. We're really fortunate to have you as an affiliate here at CSIS. So, why did you agree to do this, other than that you're interested in the issues?
Well, first of all, let me say it's a delight to be on stage with such esteemed colleagues as Charlene and Steve and you, Dan. And as you pointed out, my background is more from the commercial environment and the private sector environment. I've spent a great deal of my career working on infrastructure issues. And I had the great privilege and pleasure, actually, to live for about a year in China. And I was absolutely astounded by not just the built infrastructure environment there, but the environment for innovation and the way in which innovations were technical innovations were intersecting with infrastructure. And when I came back to the U.S., By happenstance, I had an opportunity I was invited to speak at a CSIS event by Matt. And Matt mentioned to me that infrastructure is a topic that CSIS is continuing to focus on, and I said I'd certainly be happy to contribute what I can, primarily from a commercial perspective, from a competitiveness perspective, from the implications of technology as it intersects with infrastructure, and this task force opportunity came up, and it was really a great opportunity to contribute in that capacity. So I certainly appreciated that.
Good. Okay. So Steve, thanks for being here. And so you've got plenty of other asks of your time. So why'd you agree to invest some of your time with us and help us with this?
Well, in addition to the chance of co-chairing something with Charlene, which is always a plus, I did it because John Hamre asked me. And John Hamre is one of this country's great public servants.
Amen.
And if he
Amen.
asks you to do something, you got to have a reason not to do it. I got into it, I think, because of China and the One Belt, One Road initiative, which I do think is the most visionary and strategic initiative of the 21st century so far. I mean, it is, we can go into great detail about how it works for China in so many different dimensions. But that's really, and what I did not see was a thoughtful, sustainable American approach and response to the One Belt, One Road initiative. When I got into it, of course, the size of the task overwhelms you, and you realize it's much bigger than China. I mean, Charlene mentioned, I think the estimate is the Asia infrastructure requirement will be 26 trillion between now and 2030. And everybody says, well, China says they're going to do 1.3 trillion. Well, 1.3 trillion is a big number where I come from. But if the need in Asia only is 26 trillion between now and 2030, you can see that this is a much bigger thing than just about China. And what I think I wanted to do was to take a look at it from the standpoint of American interests. And this is something Charlene pushed from the very beginning. What are America's interests here? What are America's priorities? And what are America's competitive advantages? And how do you knit those together into a strategy? And that's what we think we did. And we can talk a little bit about the recommendations, but I came away with a sense that if we will get in the game and use our advantages in a prioritized way where it's in our interests, we can manage this problem. Not only, it will provide a platform where we can protect our interests, where we can help the world get the quality infrastructure that it needs and that we need the world to have if it is going to be a prosperous and secure future for all of us. And it will be a platform for which we can deal with China and everybody else. So the real bottom line is we can do this, we can make a contribution here, it's in our interest to do so, but we got to get in the game ourselves, and we got to rally our friends and allies to the cause. Yeah. And that's where I came to see this report as an opportunity to make that point, and I think that's what we tried to do.
Could I add just one thing, which actually you had pointed out a couple of meetings ago, but it bears repeating, and I figured you'd say it, but you haven't, so I'll say it, but you're the one who said it, which is, we're in a fortuitous situation if the U.S. government acts, because the areas of highest stakes on this infrastructure build-out revolve around two in particular: technology and energy. And the U.S. has strong competitive advantages in both of those areas. Right. And they are both rather cost-effective areas for us. We have limited resources. We need a lot of focus. It can't be everywhere. Not everywhere matters. But you have to figure out your geographies. You have to figure out the countries. You have to figure out the projects. But as you look at the highest stakes, as Steve had pointed out, as I said a few meetings ago of the task force, as you look at the highest stakes areas, those areas favor U.S. advantages.
Can I jump in here? I think these are really important points, and I think you'd find that U.S. companies are anxious to get involved and to expand and to apply their technologies and know-how overseas. But as the report points out, they face some competitive disadvantages vis-a-vis the Belt and Road program as it's currently designed and being delivered by China. And so the report goes into some recommendations about how to mobilize private capital. Let's face it, Steve talked about 26 trillion needed in Asia alone. The estimates run to 90 trillion for the globe. There is a lot of private capital in the world, somewhere around $100 trillion in institutional investment assets around the world. If we can tap some aspect of that, we will apply a lot of additional resource to the infrastructure projects and infrastructure markets. But to date, and the report deals with this, to date, we really haven't mobilized around this opportunity. U.S. capital markets are the most efficient in the world and the most innovative. And if we can bring that innovation to bear around these particular challenges and tie that in with some project packaging that accelerates project life cycles and emphasize the elements that make U.S. contractors distinctive in the world, and that is quality, as well as some of the soft power aspects of U.S. If you speak with many people around the world, they have great admiration for U.S. companies and U.S. people. And so not only do we deliver quality through our companies, but we also deliver a certain set of values which people have high regard for also. So, but we need to mobilize ourselves to be able to stay in the game, much less to win the game if there is a winner.
Peter, it's fair to say that this is going to happen with or without the United States,
Yes.
right? Is that fair to say?
Yeah.
So it's probably in our best interest to get in the game.
Absolutely,
Right.
yeah. And it's not like we're completely out of the game, but we're playing with a different set of tools than China is playing currently. And so I think we need to, as we've recommended in the report, we need to focus on some of these tools that will enable not only U.S. companies, but Western companies in conjunction with U.S. companies to succeed in these competitions.
Please.
I was just going to say, I mean, if you think about the Power Africa project that's going on, one of Matt Goodman's favorite phrases is crowding in money as opposed to crowding out money. And so if you look at that project, U.S. interest in electricity availability in poorest countries, for example, you have the U.S. getting in the game, then all these multilateral institutions join in, and, you know, a ton of private sector companies put money in. And all of a sudden, you take some U.S. effort, and this effort is magnified many, many fold. That's the kind of thinking we would need behind the infrastructure build out in the areas of greatest strategic value to the United States.
Absolutely, absolutely. But this isn't a quiz on the exact recommendations, so if you want to speak to the specific recommendations, but I'm hoping each of you would say, what are the bumper stickers you want folks to come away with from the report? Now, some of this you've spoken about in your earlier answers, but what are some of the top 2 or 3 messages, the top line messages, either that you took away from the last 9 months of work that you want to share, or that you feel like you want to just double underline as part of the report? Maybe Charlene, can I start with you?
3, strategic selection of countries or sub-geographies. Number 2, strategic focus on sectors where we have the greatest competitive advantages. And number 3, mobilizing private capital.
Amen. Great. Peter?
Yeah, I would say I think the report does a great job in setting the context, the magnitude of infrastructure that is going to be built around the world. Secondly, that frankly, as we've just been talking about, as far as the U.S. is concerned, we haven't really stepped up to the game yet in terms of responding to that, both opportunity and challenge. But thirdly, that we have a lot of assets that we can bring to the table. We've already talked about some of them, our leadership in certain aspects of technology, in the energy sector, capital markets formation, as well as our competitive spirit. I think that we would find a lot of success by implementing many of these recommendations. But the takeaways, as I said, are that the opportunity and challenge is massive. We have not yet kind of awoken to the opportunity and challenge, but we have a lot of assets on the American side of the ledger, which would be very beneficial to us. And I also want to say something that we didn't hit so heavily, but we do mention it in the report, and that is that I don't see this, and I'm not sure we all see this as an either-or game, right? I think there are ways in which the U.S. and China can cooperate on projects around the world, and we should, as we should with other countries and other companies around the world. So it's not kind of an either-or, black or white, but there certainly are places where the U.S. from a national security standpoint and from a commercial standpoint needs to be investing more effectively.
So a lot of it's been covered. One of the thematics, which is really on the title, which is what we call the higher road, quality. Mm-hmm. Focusing on quality infrastructure. And one of the things I like about the report is that it has a set of principles on what quality infrastructure means. It picks some from the EU has a version, the Japanese have a version. We tried to pull them together. It is free, it is open, it is resilient infrastructure, but it's transparent, it is open, it is fiscally responsible, environmentally responsible, socially responsible. It is resilient. It is sustainable. These are the kinds of, what the world needs is that kind of infrastructure. And the problem so far with the Belt and Road Initiative is it has tended to be fast. It has tended to focus more on the benefits to Chinese workers and companies than the recipient countries. And it has resulted in a big tail of debt that is difficult to sustain. So we think we ought to rally the world behind the notion of quality infrastructure, rally the world behind those set of principles. And one of the reasons to get into the game is who's in the game sets the standards. And we want the standards to reflect the kind of infrastructure that is both quality but also will knit the world together. And in that respect, one of the things we say very clearly is there are some areas where they are a priority for the United States, and the biggest one we talk about is the digital infrastructure. And we can't allow anybody to dominate, much less monopolize that, whoever it is. It's got to be open, and we've got to be a player in that area. But there are other areas of infrastructure in other geographic areas we don't care so much about. And there, we ought to be prepared to welcome China and cooperate with China, but also, again, as an international community, encourage China to meet those high standards. So it is quality infrastructure that benefits the country in which it's being deployed and that meets all those standards we talk about. And that's really our response to how to think about how to respond to the Belt and Road Initiative.
Yeah, can I ask Peter and Charlene, could I ask each of you to just talk a little bit about China? And if I just say China, could you word associate a little bit China and infrastructure, how you react to that?
Look, I think the most critical area is 5G. Because as Steve said, whoever wires the world, the word wire is an old word, but I'll use it because it's nice to have a visual, sets the standards. Sets the hardware, sets the upgrades. It's what your phone has to connect with. It's what your iPad has to connect with. It's what every digital sensor ultimately has to connect with. It is what makes augmented reality possible. It is what makes autonomous driving possible. It is what makes artificial intelligence impossible, all in real time, high analytic compute power, and high predictive quality to the outcomes thrown out in real time. So this is an area that we cannot have other countries dominate. It's an area, if you think about where US wealth is created today, and we think about the digital economy, that's $400 billion, digital services, $400 billion in exports a year from the US. Just as a matter of scale, soybeans is 30. 400 billion.
Wow.
It's 5.6 million jobs in the U.S. This is an area of enormous
Wow.
importance to the United States. So getting in this game with respect to the network build-out, these are large-scale networks in 5G, building the towers, upgrading the hardware, upgrading and changing the devices connected to the hardware, creating new things like sensors connected to the hardware. All of this becomes vitally important to the United States. It has to be open. Our economy depends on this kind of data flow and connectivity being open. And if we think about the most extreme case, where that connectivity is cabined off, where the government exercises sovereign rights over the internet in particular geographies, we can see immediately this is not good for the United States, not economically, not with respect to security, given that most new technologies on 5G are dual use. They're as important for military applications as they are for commercial. So this is an area that I think is of enormous importance for the United States. Our own build-out in this country lags far behind China's build-out in China. I think that's unfortunate, because one would think one would want to build out one's country first and foremost. But hopefully, we'll move along in this effort.
Let's just stay on 5G for a minute and ask, I want to hear from both of you about this, and I want to broaden it out a little bit further about China, but let's just focus on 5G. So Peter, can you, if I said to you 5G, what's your reaction to 5G?
Well, I think there's been a lot of talk, and Charlene has really summarized the issues on 5G very well. But I think you have to look at the whole technology ecosystems that are being built and established, even pre-5G, where the groundwork is being laid around sensors, satellite technologies, software, and the like, that are facilitating one, infrastructure delivery and operations, but also the rise of what we're calling smart cities or digital cities and the like. And
driverless cars or autonomous vehicles.
Right, and all of this is coming, and it's coming sooner, I think, than many of us anticipate. But the technology ecosystems that are developing are really fascinating, and they're moving very quickly. And one of the things that, if you look at this issue, you will see is that China has a digital ecosystem that is very intact, very integrated, very well working, very innovative, and really developing a whole series of new technology platforms and applications, some of which are in advance of the US. But it's operating in that kind of environment, and Charlene talked about open, transparent, the flow of data, et cetera. The US has advocated for standards of free flow of data and transparency and the like, and so we have the prospect of two very different visions and two very different realities emerging. A digital ecosystem that is designed and developed and working very effectively in China, and the Western system, which is developed primarily from the US, but is in much of the rest of the world. And as we look at the Belt and Road program, what we see is that we see these overlaps, where certain projects from China are bringing Chinese technology and ecosystems, digital ecosystems to bear, and the US or Western projects are bringing the Western digital ecosystems. And India is a great example of where we see this meshing and this competition, if you will, playing out. Underinvestment on the US side in technologies means that those who are investing in these technologies are going to win the hearts and minds of others, and we have to ask ourselves: are there two really different digital visions for the future, and what do those digital visions look like, and which will prevail?
Steve, you sent us on a journey on 5G. You gave us a lot of good homework on 5G and said, after every meeting, and say we need to talk to some other people because this is really serious and really important. I didn't fully understand it when we first started, and actually we started last summer. You and Charlene said, we're interested in, the two of you were interested in doing it as long as we talked about digital. I don't think we really fully, I was like, okay, digital, that sounds, I guess I get that. But after doing being involved with this for the last 9 months, I get it. But now I really get it about 5G. What is, we've had a series of side meetings about 5G as a result of sort of getting smart about this. What is your reaction to that?
So we tried in the report to have, there's one of these, text boxes, which is our effort, sort of a first draft of a U.S. strategy for 5G. Yeah. And I think it's interesting because it shows you the elements that we have to work with more generally. So the current policy, as I understand it, the dominant policy is we're going around the world saying to countries, do not let your companies buy Huawei products and equipment for their 5G networks. And that's great, and we're doing it, and good luck.
Huawei thumbs down.
And we're making some progress. But look, 5G is coming. Mm-hmm. 5G coming. The estimates are by 2024 there'll be 1.6 or 2.4 billion folks on 5G. So it's coming, and if people only can get it from Huawei, they'll take it from Huawei. So what's a policy? Well, one thing is, in terms of get in the game, our first thematic, we need to reconstruct that cooperation between government, academia, and business to invest so that U.S. companies can get in this game. So that's the first thing. So one, let's get our own house. So first, let's get in the game. Two, let's get our own house in order. Three, let's work with friends and allies, because the potential competitors to Huawei at this point are Ericsson, Nokia, and Samsung. Well, they are, companies, resident in good allies of ours. Let's see what we can do to help them become more competitive players in this game through financial incentives, maybe through technology sharing and the like. Let's make sure that we can get alternatives out there in the market. Fourth, let's use technology. That's our advantage. So one of the places we went to, which we will not identify, talked about the potential of saying, well, look, we think there is a way to develop a 5G architecture that can lay on top of equipment and physical infrastructure that is compromised, but will be resilient to penetration, to data theft, to denial of service. Well, if we can do that, so that if we fail to encourage the world not to do Huawei, we can still deploy and help countries deploy 5G networks that will be secure and that we will be comfortable communicating with them. So use technology. And finally, the sixth piece is get China on the right page. China cannot expect to be able to protect its market to the 60 to 70% level for Huawei and ZTE, and then go out in the rest of the world using that protected market and probably government subsidies to underprice all the other companies in this business in the world and put them out of business. That's not on. So one of the trade agenda items is China's got to open its market, because some of these companies we talked to say that if China has control of if Chinese companies have control of the China market and 50% of the rest of the world, the 50% of the rest of the world left for the rest of the world is not big enough to justify the investments we need to compete with Chinese companies. So it's got to be an open market, and there's got to be access to the Chinese market. So if you think about those elements, in a way, they echo throughout the report as key elements that are advantages for the United States and suggest a strategy for the United States in meeting the infrastructure challenge and taking advantage of what is not just a challenge, but is a huge opportunity for the United States and our companies and our friends and our allies.
And could I
Peter.
just add a thought here? I think one of the challenges that we have, and I think Huawei is a great example, is if you look at the history of Huawei, they have spent a lot of time and money investing. For 10 years, they were looking into the future and saying, what is 5G going to look like? And how do we develop the tools, the software, the technology, the hardware that will support 5G? And then how do we get involved in the standard setting organizations around the world so that we understand what the standards are going to be and we can help to shape the standards, et cetera. And I think we also have a risk of putting everything on 5G. When you step back and say, here's one company that made this kind of investment and now has this kind of market position. What's the next technology?
What's the
right?
6G?
Yeah, well, and what are all those next technologies? And so I think what we have failed to do in the U.S., at least to this point, is to really step back and say, okay, what is the nature and shape of technology development? Where do we need to invest in R&D? And how do we stimulate that academia, government, and commercial enterprise interaction so that we stay at the forefront? Because as we know, most of our technologies did start. We're rooted in that cooperation between those three parts of our society.
And indeed, we're still benefiting from the tail, which is a very long tail, from investments made in the 1950s and 1960s. And the level of R&D funding in the United States is sort of at a level that has gone down since then, and certainly as a percentage of GDP has gone down. At a time when our competition is very tough, very smart, exceptionally determined, and backed by a national effort to control as many of the new technologies and or be a key player among two, perhaps, in new technologies that will determine the next however many years or potentially the next generation. So the United States has done no knitting at home to put back what this sort of golden triangle was, which was academia, business, and government, with respect to fundamental R&D, but then also with respect to potential commercialization opportunities as a national imperative, and we need to get back to that kind of model. The United States benefited greatly from the Sputnik moment.
It was a wake-up call.
That was the ultimate wake-up call. Versus the situation the U.S. may be in now, where we're the frog in the boiling water. You don't realize the temperature keeps going up because you've been in the water a long time, and it just seems to just get a little hotter, but you sort of shrug it off until we know what happened to the frog. So we have to create our own Sputnik moment if it's not going to be imposed externally. One would think grand initiatives like Belt and Road might catalyze action by the U.S. It has certainly catalyzed Japan and other countries long in the infrastructure game to up their game, to act faster with greater intention, to put forward new initiatives, put forward new partnerships, while the U.S. has put forward modest proposals. That's fine, but we're not catalyzed by some of these issues as some of our closest allies are, and we need to be.
Charlene, can I add?
Let me just say, I love that we need a global infrastructure Sputnik moment here, or we need to feel like it's a global infrastructure Sputnik moment. I completely agree with that.
Just one data point that I think really emphasizes this point that you're making. Between the year 2000 and 2014, I think it is, the U.S. added about 56% more STEM four-year college graduates to something like 750,000 STEM college graduates, which is very impressive. In that same time period, China added increased STEM graduates 360% to 1.6 million. And so, of course, they have larger population, and we have some of the greatest educational institutions in the U.S., but China's educational institutions are also very dynamic and very good. So it really comes down to kind of a national strategy where education, R&D, and these other elements are very important to a long-term, sustainable technology base and commercial national security presence.
So one of the things, I think one of the responses to this has been the U.S. Development Finance Corporation, formerly known as OPIC, the institution formerly known as OPIC. It seems to me that that's a good thing. What they've done is they've doubled the credit card limit on OPIC, and they've given OPIC some additional really important instruments, and we've written about them for a long time here at CSIS. These are very good things. There's a series of important things that have come with it. And they've also given it a longer lease on life. And we've had a series of 12 years of one-year authorizations, which anyone who knows in government how painful and awful that is, it's gotten a 7-year reauthorization. Good. But I think Charlene's point about those are okay. That's a step in the right direction, but this is sort of a multi-mile hike we got to go on here. It ain't enough by a long shot. Some of the other things I'm frustrated by are things like we can't get the Ex-Im Bank fully operational. Could I just ask you all a softball question? Can we all agree that that's a colossally stupid thing, that the Ex-Im Bank is not fully functional? Can I? Yes. That all a yes? Is that all, we agree with that? So just for the record, it's a colossally stupid thing that we cannot have the Ex-Im Bank fully functional. But I think there's a series of things in the report that are some very specific things that we could be doing. I want to talk a little bit more about allies. I think, Steve, you've talked about allies and others. Could we let's just spend a little bit more time on this, because I think there have been some attempts at doing some of this as well in the Trump administration, which I think have been good, but I think I just think we misunderestimate the value of allies or the multilateral institutions. If you either wanted to talk about that, say the World Bank or the regional development banks, I'd welcome any comments on allies or the MDBs. I'd love to hear from any of you. I'm happy to add my own comments about it.
I would just say one thing. There's a debate going as, should bilateral negotiations or more multilateral negotiations
for trade
be a priority in terms of trade? Should we be working with multilateral institutions at all, or should we be working bilaterally? The infrastructure challenge and opportunity is so great that we really need the all of the above solution. So yes, we need to work bilaterally with our allies, for example, to get agreement on these principles and to get them to agree to what a set of standards should be. But then we need to work with our bilateral allies in these multilateral institutions to get them to adopt standards that are going to result in the kind of quality infrastructure and the openness that we need in this global economy. Because make no mistake, others, particularly China, are working very actively, more actively than we, in these multilateral institutions, because they've got, once you establish the standards on terms that favor them, that's a door that in some sense gets closed for us. So I would say, our friends and allies are an enormous resource in every dimension of this problem. We need to be working with them, and we need to be working with them through all these various institutions. Yeah. And, as Madeleine Albright says, multilateralism is a word that Americans don't like. It has too many syllables and it ends with an ism. And I get all that. But the truth is these institutions are important players in this space. And we have a privileged position in most of these institutions. And if we combine it with our friends and allies, we can drive outcomes that lead to the kind of infrastructure the world deserves and needs.
So just
we should do it.
So just as an editorial on that, I'd have my laissez-passer taken away from me at the World Bank from what I'm about to say, but I believe the World Bank and the regional development banks are force multipliers of a Western form of globalization. Más o menos. I mean, I think they use the American dollar, they use US or British law. Most of the technical folks are educated in the United States. The operating language is English. It's imbued with some, let's call it Western operating principles. We do also have a privileged position in terms of our votes. In terms of the World Bank, we have a 15% share. We're the largest shareholder, non-African shareholder of the African Development Bank. We're not the largest shareholder, but the largest non-African shareholder. We have the largest share of the Inter-American Development Bank. We have equal shares on the Asian Development Bank with Japan. And the EBRD, I forget what the share is, but it's pretty big. We don't have the ability on our own to do it, but if we work with the Aussies, the Japanese, the Brits, the Canadians, OECD countries, we can steer these institutions in ways that can help us with this. So I agree. And it is an ism and it doesn't come trippingly off
And
the
again,
tongue.
it's not because we're going to steer it in such a way that we get an exclusive
No,
and dominate it.
no.
That's the whole point about a set of principles, that as we talk, make it free, open, and resilient.
Yes.
It is a set of principles that will actually provide the infrastructure that world actually wants, that can lead to a more prosperous and secure
Yeah.
future. That's the goal here.
And I think that the other point to make as well is there have to be alternatives available to countries in need of infrastructure development. If the U.S. isn't providing an alternative, if our allies aren't providing an alternative, if the MDBs aren't providing an alternative, then we will, in fact, leave the Eurasian landmass to China. The implications of that are stunning for the United States. And so what you want is to have everybody involved. China as well, obviously.
Absolutely.
But not to the exclusion of everyone else. So options have to be available to countries trying to develop. If they're not, they'll go with the cheapest, fastest, on-the-ground source, and that will be China in most cases.
So I just on that, Charlene, I think I think that almost every member of Congress probably can't pronounce the port in Sri Lanka, but they all know about the port in Sri Lanka, and they don't like it. Yeah. There's this thing called the AIIB Bank in China. They're not sure if it provides car loans or has an ATM, but they know that China's got it, and they don't really, not sure what they think about it, but they probably don't like it, and they all know what the Belt and Road Initiative is. And I think if I'm a poor country and I have to choose between no port and a port that maybe includes some bribes, maybe includes some shoddily built stuff, maybe includes some, loaded up on debt, I'm probably going with door number 2. I'm probably going with if I have no other alternative, I'm probably going to go with that. I think that's true. I think it's true.
And Dan, I just want to underscore the point that I think we look at the Belt and Road Initiative from a geopolitical standpoint, but what China is offering these countries is infrastructure that many of them desperately need.
Right.
And China is the one who's calling and saying,
Right.
look, we can build this port for you. We can help you build this airport. We'll build a rail line for you. We'll bring the money, we'll bring the construction expertise, and these sorts of things. And these projects are really important to these countries. And we have not yet responded in a way that says, look, there is an alternative to, if China wants to do it, let's make it a competition. We'll have the Chinese approach or a package, and we'll have a US package, or we'll have a Western package, and let the countries decide based on that. But right now, China's really, if you talk to many of the government officials around the world, China's the only one knocking on the door, and they're offering us things that we have wanted for decades.
They're speaking to the hopes and aspirations of these countries. My view is if we don't answer the hopes and aspirations of countries, they will take their business to the Chinese.
And could I just add to that? Why is it, let's just be completely commercial for a moment. Why should the United States respond to the hopes and aspirations of poorer countries? Because 50% of all global growth over these past 10 years came from emerging markets. That's why. And if we look ahead to the next 10 years, it'll be 70% of global growth and half of global GDP. That's why, if the U.S. just simply wants to look at this as a numbers issue, that's why the United States has to care about this. We cannot be shut out from or disadvantaged in, even if not shut out, disadvantaged in half of the world's GDP and 70% of the growth. We simply cannot.
I just did 2 other things I wanted to cover, and then I know I need to go to Q&A, but Peter, could I just ask you to talk about the phenomenon of urbanization in cities? You touched on it briefly, but I think it merits a double click, if you would. Thanks.
Well, I think just about everybody knows that the trend towards urbanization is only accelerating, and the stats differ whether it's going to be 70% of the world's population or 60% of the world's population.
It's going to be a lot.
That live in urban environments. But that is absolutely kind of an irreversible trend as far as we can tell. And as you look at that urbanization, what you see is a whole host of challenges arising from, particularly in the emerging economies where people are settling in areas that are subject to flooding, so you need resilient infrastructure to deal with that, or locations for them to live in, to issues such as water and sanitation and the like. And the really exciting thing, I think, that's happening in the world today is how digital technologies are making some of these challenges much less ominous. And for example, you can equip water systems now with sensors that show you, where and when water leaks are happening, so you can fix them better. You can deploy smart grid technologies in cities that allow you to, power up portions of the city based on solar or renewable energy that you could never get to before. There are just a host of new opportunities through technology to address the challenges and the opportunities of urbanization. But again, it's a situation where U.S. companies are really leaders in many of these technologies today, but are not really having the chance to deploy them at scale the way they are being deployed in other parts of the world. And China's very good at that. If you've spent any time in China and had the opportunity to operate on their digital ecosystems, you will see you can get pretty much anything you want via your smartphone. And that is enabling better city management, lower cost of financing, more rapid delivery of projects, and a whole host of other things. So urbanization is here to stay as far as most of us can tell, and technology will be a great enabler of doing that.
And much of the infrastructure conversation is going to be around cities or the urbanization phenomenon.
Yeah, from mass transit, and we talked about autonomous vehicles before, but all of these other aspects, from smart grids and fintech solutions, so you don't need a credit card or even to be banked. You can do it through your mobile phone and the like. All of these technologies are present and accelerating.
Can I just ask, so Steve and Charlene, I want to make sure that the audience and that are watching on television it was not our intention that this is not an anti-China report. So I would like, could you each just so people walk away from this conversation about what is our message about China in this report, that I think we have a nuanced view about China. I think it's fair to say it's been a wake-up call, but they're doing a lot of things that we want them to keep doing. But could you just each talk about that? Because I think I don't want folks walking out of this room saying, this was, and I don't think the conversation has gone that way, but I think sometimes folks can have a willful interpretation that isn't the case. But I want to be doubly sure that we're clear about that.
So we've had a huge, I think, and useful corrective about China over the last 3 or 4 years. In some sense, a lot of things were happening in China we weren't paying as much probably attention to as we should. So we now see them as much more of an economic competitor. We see their growing military capability, which our military is now focused on. We see them as a much more formidable geopolitical player. And we see them as an ideological alternative to us and a competitor for us. And that's what they are. They are a great power that is not an emerging great power. They have emerged. And it is therefore going to be a new era of U.S.-China relations. And it's going to be an era where we're going to be more competitive. We are going to be strategic competitors. And the issue is, does that mean that we're going to become adversaries? And does that increase the risk of confrontation and conflict? It could, but my belief is it does not need to. But it will require us to do something that's very difficult and for which there are not a lot of precedents, which is we're going to have to be strategic competitors and strategic cooperators at the same time, because there are a lot of issues, whether it is terrorism, the global financial system, whether it is climate change, a whole series of issues that confront all of us on this globe that neither China and the United States can solve alone, and both of us need solved if we're either going to get the Chinese dream or the American dream. And those are areas where we need to be cooperating. So the issue is, can we be strategic competitors and strategic cooperators at the same time? And our approach in this report, our three-tiered framework, what we've talked about in terms of 5G, very much is in line that. There are going to be areas where we're going to be strategic competitors, and we've got to get in the game and make the investments and work with our friends and allies, so we are playing in areas which are of economic and national security importance to us. At the same time, there are other areas, particularly infrastructure areas, where China has a competitive advantage, we don't, where the world needs the infrastructure, and if China is willing to put the money to do it, that would be great. Our only request is, do it right. Meet these standards and these principles. Come up with high-quality infrastructure. If they're willing to do this, great. We should be supportive. You mentioned the Asia Infrastructure Investment Bank. It's early days, but it seems to be a better institution than we thought it was going to be. And if you talk to the director of it, he's running a pretty good bank. That's where we want China to be, rather than where this One Belt, One Road has started out, which has been really a geostrategic and economic instrument of Chinese policy. So I think what we tried to capture in this report is we're going to be strategic competitors, but we also can be strategic cooperators. But that requires us to be engaged and to be leading and to be paying attention. And if there's one thing I would put over the front of this report, it is, please, America, pay attention.
Charlene, do you want to add anything to that?
Nah, just a ditto.
All right. You all have been a very patient audience. I'd love to get some questions from the audience. I've got a lot of friends in the audience. I'm happy to call on them if I don't get some interesting questions. So, okay. So I want to hear from this gentleman back there with the tie, the suit and tie right there. Yep. This woman here with the sunglasses, and this gentleman sitting next to her. And we'll bunch them together. Name, rank, serial number. Keep your questions short. Don't grandstand.
Okay, thanks. Ram Mahindra, IFC, 25 years in infrastructure. Two things that it's an observation really. I'm worried that I haven't seen a greater sense of worry from all of you. We talk about China doing A, B, and C, and then we talk about the US coming up with a response. And I see two very different systems. China is a single country and a single focus, as you've mentioned, and they've been able to do that incredibly well. And so when I look at infrastructure in China, and I spent a couple of years there, infrastructure in China, what China did was really finish their infrastructure, overbuilt it, and then started looking outside. We haven't done that yet. And so I think that's an area where it's difficult for us to push hard and claim the high ground when we drive down George Washington Parkway and have to replace our tires, right? So I think we have an issue there, and it's not anybody else, it's us. American Association of Civil Engineers comes and gives us the D. So that's one area. The second thing I think where we really can make a difference is on this 150 trillion of institutional money.
Yeah.
It's something we've been working on too, and we really need to focus on how do you get that. Insurance companies and pension funds have fiduciary responsibilities.
Sovereign wealth company
and
money.
they simply are not willing to do it unless we change the rules of the game.
Yeah.
Yes.
So we've got to think really closely.
What I would suggest is we bunch these together, but while I have Team IFC, we'll give the gentleman the microphone just for a second. So shouldn't we be using guarantees more? Should we be using MIGA, which is part of the World Bank Group, or should we be using other instruments? How should we be using, if you were the head of IFC and you had a very pliant board, what would you be doing at IFC differently to juice up, use the bank group?
Since I'm leaving IFC in 2 days, I can afford to go out on a limb.
Speak freely. Speak freely.
So anything I say is my own views.
Yeah.
Let me
Let's talk afterwards too.
Let's talk afterwards, because we are talking still, IFC and all the multilateral banks do about 40 billion a year in private sector.
Yeah.
We are talking trillions, right? Trillions.
Yeah.
And there is money sitting out there, the Canadian pension funds, the Dutch, the US pension funds. But it's very different, right? Their regulators, for example, will slam them if they invest in sub-investment grade. And yet, every one of these projects is typically sub-investment grade. So how do we do it? Do we get a first loss? And which is what we've been doing.
Right.
But let's talk about it.
Okay.
I would urge you to look at the report.
Yeah.
Because one of the 7 recommendations deals with getting private finance into the game. And they're very concrete, specific recommendations. And take a look at those.
I mean,
if you have some others, we'd like to add them, but they're there.
And let me just say, look, the two issues I think for the private sector are risk mitigation and return on invested capital. Right? That's what it's all about. You want a return on your investment, and you want that return at the lowest possible risk level. And so the report talks a little bit about both of those areas, but there's an awful lot of work that needs to be done to get that money off the sidelines, exactly for the reason you said, which is pension funds, for example, have fiduciary responsibilities. So they're very reluctant, absent a more assured pathway toward return on investment as well as reduced risk.
Dan, if I could just jump in on this.
Yeah. Since you've only got 2 more days left of ISC.
That's right. No, I think you've all put your finger on this, which is you've talked about. When you talk about the U.S. and the U.S. approach, the U.S. approach is really so loosely structured. We're talking about the triangle, which existed, which kind of faded, which we've got to recreate. It's not going to come up in one day. Whereas the Chinese have put forward a very robust structure, right? And so they're offering the Africas of this world an alternative. And so it's not enough for us to say, here are the set of standards and everybody live by these standards. We've got to provide those alternatives, and we've got to provide them quickly and effectively.
Okay. All right. These 2 folks up here, my friend with the sunglasses, and then the gentleman sitting next to her. Please.
Thank you for your remarkable presentation. So my name is Anita Parlow, and my question has to do more with the Arctic, if I may. I worked on a project at Harvard, MIT, and then the Wilson Center Polar Code with Russia, Canada, US, and then recently a Fulbright Fellow 2 years ago. So I appreciate everything you've been saying about 5G, and there's no question about it, and God, is that serious. So my question is more bricks and mortar-y. So you got Polar Belt and Road, you got it up, going up the Bering and then across the Northern Sea Route, and who knows, the Northwest Passage, and you've got all this development going on, $1 billion into Sabetta Port, money into oil, gas mining, LNG, and that's going on, and it's needed. It's oil, gas mining going in, probably back to China, destinational stuff. So good point about that we're not looking for enemies, and good point about how and whether to engage, monitor, et cetera. So how, is this okay? The kind of development that's going on sure is needed, and in the end may actually even improve our economy. But geostrategically speaking, does that get in our way? Thank you very much.
Let me get a couple more, please, sir.
Thank you. I'm currently a Fulbright Scholar. So my name is Dr. Wakaf Malik. I'm at the Elliott School Seeger Center. My question also relates to the previous first question, in fact, but in a slight different orientation, more talking about the timelines. Now, how are you going to get US government, allies, all the institutions within different allied countries, private enterprise, private capital, development companies, construction companies on the ground together and make a blueprint that takes advantage of the expertise and the advantages that these particular countries have, and be able to compete with what China is doing, given that they're going to have a larger share of it, and they're far ahead already. And they are a single country who's doing this, and you'd have a divisive issues, a lot of problems, a lot of litigation, a lot of other issues, division within all this mesh of different organizations, countries, and companies to do this. So when you can get the blueprint ready, how long will it take? And how far back will you be? Do you really think, realistically, bricks and mortar, on the ground realities? Because I've been around those areas a lot, and I know it's not that easy.
Okay, let me get one. Let's get another. Okay, my friend Alex here.
Thank you very much for a great report. Thank you, Dan. Alexander Kravitz from Insight. I want to pick up on one of the themes from the soon-to-be former IFC official that asked the question, which echoed what Ambassador Barshefsky was talking about the knitting at home.
Yeah.
What I'm thinking about is, and Dan asked about the allies, but I'm thinking about who are the internal allies, if you will, the domestic allies. Who are the policymakers, the government officials currently in government, who get it, and who are going to make this a reality? Because one could imagine a scenario where for the next 2 or for the next 6 years, the US policy as Steve Hadley described, it continues to be stopping companies from buying Huawei 5G equipment. So who, and if you would mention some names, that would be great, who gets it here? And who would be, the implementers of these recommendations? Thank you.
So
Yeah, let's start.
I won't respond to all of this,
Yeah,
but
don't
or
do-
even
yeah.
try to, but simply make 2 points. One, on the knitting at home, put aside disagreements among some people, should we try and stop Huawei or not? Whatever we do with Huawei has nothing to do with our ability to deploy 5G in our own country. And it's not going to speed up deployment or slow down deployment in our own country. So you're right, we have to shift our focus, put aside Huawei for a moment, make a policy decision there and carry it out, fine. But if our policy is somehow stopping Huawei will help the United States, not if we don't have anything to sell, and not if we're not 5G compatible at home. So, I think Huawei in that sense is a complete distraction and sort of a red herring. And then on the Belt and Road, look, this is such an enormous concept. I said in the beginning, this is true grand strategy, because you have a land Belt and Road, a maritime Belt and Road, a cyber Belt and Road, space, Arctic. These are all in the Belt and Road, and they are obviously all-encompassing. China's rhetoric on the Arctic is the most interesting. They view themselves as a near-Arctic country with the rights of an Arctic country. This sounds very familiar, like the South China Sea and the Nine-Dash Line. So the U.S. has no response on any of this, or very little. We have an Indo-Pacific strategy, the free and open Indo-Pacific, which is okay. Query, is that going to go anywhere, really? If we're doing it to force people ultimately to choose sides, I would suggest we not. We know what happened with the AIIB when we asked countries to choose sides. So I think that we, the United States, has to decide what our continuing position in the world should look like. And just we, the United States, leave China aside, leave everyone else aside. We need to say, where do we want to be as a country globally? And we have to say, step one is our economy at home, what we need at home, infrastructure, education, and so on. Because if we're not strong at home, the rest will not happen. Period, full stop. Strong at home and more innovative and inventive at home, and so on. And what's our conception for the world? We used to have these kinds of plans coming out of World War II, certainly, right? What was the Marshall Plan, if not that day's Belt and Road?
Yeah.
Of course, the Marshall Plan in today's dollars was $100 million. It's like chump change. But it was money well spent at the time, even though controversial at the time. So we need this kind of dispassionate but clever and strategic thinking. I don't see that going on, certainly not in the economic and commercial sphere. There may be more on the military side that Steve could comment on, but certainly if we look at the commercial sphere, I don't see serious efforts in that regard.
Okay, Peter?
Yeah, maybe I'll respond to the financial instruments questions that have come up. And I think actually IFC has pioneered a couple of interesting, I think it's a managed co-lending portfolio program, which has brought institutional investors together with the IFC to solve a couple of fundamental problems. And it's small, but hopefully it could be scaled. One is project packaging. Infrastructure projects are incredibly complex. Right? They involve so many different types of risks. Each project is pretty much bespoke. There are different soil conditions and environmental conditions and NGOs, and so there's a lot of work that goes into putting a deal together. And those risks are those early development packaging risks are ones that typically institutional investors don't want to take on. And then you get into the financing risks around, is it investment grade country, much less an investment grade project. And then you have political risks, and you have foreign currency risks, and you have breach of contract risks, and all these sorts of things. And what China has been able to do, I think, very nicely is they go in and they say, okay, we'll put all this together in a package, right? We'll look at all of these dimensions of the project, and we will give you the financing at this cost, and we will give you the construction, and we will give you this kind of warranty period, and you will get a product in very quick order. And to the point that was made from the soon-to-be former gentleman from the IFC, that it takes a long time to put these things together. It does, and we are not well coordinated to do it. But we cannot, I think, as a country, do this ourselves on our own just with public resources, and this is what the report points out. So we need to bring our allies together, we need to bring our partners together, and in some cases, yes, absolutely, the Chinese to do things together, and that has to start with specific projects. You have to say, okay, we're going to sit down with the Japanese and we're going to pick 2 or 3 projects to the point of prioritization, and we are going to figure out, we're going to bring the Japanese companies and the US companies, European companies together, and we're going to come up with a project package, okay, and we're going to bring the finance, we're going to work with DFC, we're going to work with JBEC, and we're going to work with the other resources, and okay, here is a project that we can demonstrate that we do it on. And there are going to be problems, right? Don't think that the Chinese companies, state-owned enterprises and financiers don't have problems with these projects, because they do, but they work them out internally, right? We don't really see those coming to the light of day. And so we need to be much more deliberate about how we put together our teams and how we put together the financing and package this in a way that allows us to move forward, even if there are some risks. And the government has a role in helping to mitigate those risks, or the international multilateral development institutions have a role there.
Steve?
Sort of last quick comments. One, you write about we have infrastructure needs here and they need to be addressed. It's one of the things we say in our preface, but we've got to do both. We've got to both do the infrastructure investments we need at home and be a player in the infrastructure abroad. And if those, in some sense, will be competing for resources, but in some respects they also may be complementary. Second, on the urgency, this is a long-term project. Yes. The infrastructure requirements are out to 2030, 2040, 2050. And it's a huge bill. Remember, the needs in Asia to 2030 are 26 trillion, and China's only pledged 1.3 trillion. So there's a lot of room for additional participation. And the Chinese approach has had real problems. There has been a lot of buyer's remorse that we're all familiar with on these projects. So let's not paint the Chinese effort as 10 feet tall. If we're willing to get in the game and act to protect our own interests, we can do that. On the Arctic, it's interesting. We're not arguing for an exclusive for anybody, not us, not the Chinese. We're basically saying level playing field, set of principles that ensures quality, and then let everybody play. That's I think where we are in the Arctic, because there are a lot of folks who have a lot of interest in the Arctic that they can legitimately press. There are internal allies. The Build Act is very interesting. It finally got done. Executive and legislative cooperation, bipartisan bill.
Amazing.
It gives us something to work on. And one of the reasons the report is structured the way it is, and I do hope you go online and look at it, they're very concrete suggestions. Things the administration can do, things you could drop into a bill in Congress right now. It's a very set of concrete recommendations in the 7 key areas that we think that are the key elements of a strategy. So we think we've mapped it out right there, and we would hope, and we will be going around both to the Hill and the administration to draw their attention to. We think we've given them a lot to work with, and we hope they will.
Look, you all have been a very patient audience. I'd love to get some more questions, but I think we're running out of time. I apologize. I hope my speakers will stick around for a few minutes and just say hello if you want to grab them or grab me afterwards. So please join me in thanking the panelists.
Thank you.